repetitive and boring. So let me now dive into Tolentino, Gia Tolentino. So again, as I said, the chapter for today is called Always Be Optimizing, and it's in this book here. Your cover may look different. It may be that like goldenrod or black cover. It's the same book. And the chapter that we're looking at specifically is called Always Be Optimizing. So the first thing I want to say, and again, I'll try my best to highlight as I go so that you can follow this video. You can pause and you'll know where you paused because it's highlight. The first thing I will say is you'll want to think of this chapter as a way of considering or anticipating counter arguments. And here are the questions that I would lead with, especially keeping in mind these prompts. And I'll make the prompts different colors just for funsies. Why not? Light gray work. Yeah, it's not too bad. Okay, so think of this chapter as a way of considering or anticipating counter arguments. Well, you might say, oh, counter arguments, that's new. Well, look at the visual map video. And if you haven't looked at that yet, one of the things the visual map video talks about is how in your essay you can address counter arguments. Here's the whole point of addressing counter arguments. You do so that you can break them down and show why your side is still the preferable one, okay? It shows that you're objective. It shows that you've anticipated that people are gonna try and poke holes in your argument, but you still have to show them why your argument is the best one, okay? You know, I'll give you an example. You know, reading is wonderful for you. And US students are probably looking at me right now, especially as the semester progresses, and you're saying things like, yeah, but it's boring. Yeah, but I lose my attention quickly. Yeah, but I'd rather watch it in a video. And so those are counter arguments to my argument, right? That reading is great, it's good for you. So let's go one by one with those, right? It's boring. Well, you know the old saying, right? If you're bored, then you're the one who's boring. I'm not trying to knock anyone down a peg or anything here, but what I mean is that you should ask yourself why you're bored. Are you bored because you don't understand? Are you bored because it's not something that generally interests you? Are you bored because your attention span is being sucked up by other things, by work and tiredness and family and whatever else? And then when you get to the core of that, you know, again, try as much as you can to take out the value judgments you're placing on certain things. Like, what I mean by that is, like, you can look at a chore and be like, oh, it's gonna suck and it's gonna take forever. And it does, because you're kind of putting a negative value judgment toward it. Or you can just be like, that exists as a thing with neutral connotations, not negative or positive. And I have to do that thing, so I'll do it, right? And what I would say instead to do, and you should be doing this everywhere in academia, everywhere in your academic careers, is to shoehorn yourself, to shove yourself in to whatever topic, whatever situation, whatever argument, find your inroads. So, okay, maybe you don't like talking about women's issues. I do, but you know, not everyone is me, luckily for you all, right? So maybe you like talking about films, and there are plenty of films and television shows that are mentioned in this. So what point is Tolentino making with those examples, right? Maybe you were in the Peace Corps, or you were interested in joining the Peace Corps, and Tolentino talks about that in this chapter. Maybe that's your inroads, right? Maybe you do hate social media because it forces people to constantly behave in a way where they appear perfect. And that's referenced in this chapter, right? Then you go into that inroads. So what I'm saying is, you know, counter arguments are not fun because we have to exist in a space where we don't want to exist. We have to exist in the space of the people who disagree with us. But we do that, one, so that we respect our opponents first and foremost, but two, so that, again, when we consider their side, we can now take their skepticism and address it in a way that makes them listen to us. It makes them hear why our side is the superior one, right? So that being said, here are some questions to think about in terms of considering or anticipating counterarguments. And counterarguments are not always yes or no. That's an argument fallacy known as the either or fallacy, right? Sometimes it's yes, sometimes it's no, sometimes I was actually looking at it this way, sometimes it's neutral, sometimes it's I don't care, sometimes it's did you even consider this perspective? You know, it's any number of things. So don't think of counterarguments on this sort of binary yes or no, because then you're just going to fall into a trap. Think of them in terms of, you know, if we were sitting in a classroom and you looked across the classroom and you asked people who their favorite band is or their favorite rap group or whoever, you're going to get 27 different responses, give or take. Those are all counterarguments, right? Those are all differing opinions as to who is the best musician or musical group, okay? And everybody has their reasons. But it's your job as the rhetor, knowing that they don't feel the same way as you do, to anticipate those, to address those, and again, to show ultimately why your side is the stronger one. So from this chapter, a couple questions we should ask, especially as we think about Tolentino in relation to the essay prompts. So optimizing, right? Think about the title and what goes on in this chapter. When we talk about optimization or the optimal or optimizing, a lot of times what we're talking about is this sort of striving for perfection, of being the best, not just the best selves we can be, but the best amongst others. And some people might conflate that with the good, right? The public good. What is the difference between striving for perfection and striving for the public good, or being perfect and being a good person? What are the differences there, especially as Tolentino points them out and as you see them applied in the real world? So piggybacking off of that, right? What might be the pitfalls we encounter in contemporary society, meaning in our world today, that prevent us from doing good despite our best intentions and actions? What are things that happen that as we're trying to get to the public good, they kind of hold us back? Even seemingly neutral, banal, good things, right? They don't have to be bad things. It's not always about like, we're not an anti-racist society because of Nazis. Sometimes it's like, we're not an anti-racist society because people experience learned helplessness in protesting and are exhausted, so we have to think about pitfalls we encounter in contemporary society, right? And what does, again, always bring it back to the text. What does Tolentino say? How do you interpret that in the real world? Another question after reading Tolentino, right, is might there be a connection between a constant striving to be, or at least appear, optimal and experiencing learned helplessness? What do you think that connection is? So in other words, if we're trying all the time to be optimal or to be perfect, is there a connection there to that constant striving to be optimal and perfect to experiencing some form of learned helplessness as Peterson describes them? Do you, you can make this personal in your discussion board. The discussion boards are where you first get those ideas off the ground, right? Do you experience, even though there's not a discussion board for this reading, but this is the kind of stuff you should be doing initially, right? Do you experience any sort of learned helplessness in your quest for personal perfection? That might be another way of asking that question. And then finally, think about Tolentino herself, right? Where in this chapter does she discuss ways in which she was trying to be a good person, speaking and or doing well for the public good? And where was she more trying to optimize herself and be perfect? And in those discussions between this scenario and that scenario, what do you see as the difference? Like, what was she doing in being a good person for the public good that she wasn't doing in perfecting herself, and vice versa, right? If you're into the kind of cultural examples that she provides, you may want to think about what these have to do with this idea of optimization, right? Of being perfect, and how that's not always necessarily for the public good, right? So you might want to consider how, when she talks about the bar method, especially if this is stuff that y'all do. Like, I know people who do bar. I don't. I'm far too lazy for that kind of rigorous exercise. But I know people who do it. She joined the Peace Corps again. Thanks a lot, Tolentino. Thanks for making the rest of us look bad. We get it. You're pretty optimal. She talks about, like, she culls from other researchers and writers and synthesizes their ideas into her argument, which is exactly what you're going to be doing in all of your essays, not just essay 1. She talks about Naomi Wolf's discussion of the beauty myth, and then Tolentino applies that to other things she's seen, right? She talks about athleisure. She talks about Susan G. Cole's discussion of how we, eroticize social values to make them more appealing. And by eroticize, I mean like sexualize, right? She talks about various examples from film, television, and books where we see this sort of optimization, particularly as it pertains to women. But I think anyone who's not a woman can still understand, some of these scenarios. So she goes into Black Mirror, Ingrid Goes West, Westworld, Ex Machina, Sophie Kinsella novels. So if any of those are like, oh, I watched that or I read that, you might want to consider like what that has to do with optimization. I personally just watched a series on Netflix called Unwell. And one of the things that this made me think of this, I should say, is there was one about intermittent fasting, and sort of there was a man in San Francisco who was like a tech guy, and he talked about like how intermittent fasting makes people optimal, right? And so like I thought about that in terms of all these things that Tolentino is talking about, right? But is that necessarily for the public good? Could be, could not be, could, whatever. It's for you to decide. So these are all the sort of cultural phenomena, and there's plenty more that she goes over, but these are just kind of ones that, I brought to your attention. And the last thing I want to go over in this video is the conclusion of this chapter. Again, thinking about optimization versus the public good. And I just want to read little excerpts from the conclusion of this chapter. If you are reading along, my book, it's page 93, but it's essentially like the last page and a half of this chapter. I won't read it all. I'll kind of skip to the parts that I think are important. But let's, again, as you hear this, think about what it has to do with optimization, with the public good, with perfectionism versus the good, right? In real life, women are so much more obedient. Our rebellions are so trivial and small. She goes on to say, resistance to a system is presented on the terms of the system. It's so much easier when we gain agency to adapt rather than to oppose. And just for clarification, agency is essentially like the ability for any, autonomous living person to make their own decisions. It's personal power, in other words. So resistance to a system is presented on the terms of the system. It's so much easier when we gain agency to adapt rather than to oppose. Technology, in fact, has made us less than oppositional. Where beauty is concerned, we've deployed technology not only to meet the demands of the system, but to actually expand these demands. The realm of what is possible for women has been exponentially expanding in all beauty-related capacities, and remain stagnant in many other ways. Okay, so that speaks directly to beauty. And then on at the end of that paragraph, she says, we have not optimized our wages, our childcare system, our political representation. We still hardly even think of parity, meaning 50-50, as realistic in those arenas, let alone anything approaching perfection. We have maximized our capacity as market assets. That's all. For the way out, I think we have to follow the cyborg. We have to be willing to be disloyal, to undermine. The cyborg is powerful because she grasps the potential in her own artificiality, because she accepts without question how deeply it is embedded in her. The machine is us, our processes, an aspect of our embodiment, Haraway wrote. Haraway is another author she's referencing. We can be responsible for machines. The dream of the cyborg is not of a common language, but of a powerful, infidel heteroglossia. Look that one up. A form of speech contained inside another person's language, one whose purpose is to introduce conflict from within. It's possible if we want it, but do we want it? What would you want? What desires, what forms of insubordination, what would you be able to access if you had succeeded in becoming an ideal woman or person? Gratified and beloved, proof of the efficiency of a system that magnifies and diminishes you every day. And that is also a great question to end on, right? Is this incessant quest for optimization, if it's not controlled by us, how is it for the public good? Or how can we respond to it in a way in which we are working for the public good? So I know these are really heady sort of questions to consider, but they're great, right? Like these are the questions, you know, when everyone else is telling you like, oh, go, 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 you got to get out of community college in 2 years and go, 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 you got to get into the workforce and go, go, go. These are the questions where we can actually go, wait, hold on, let's be skeptical, let's think about the world, let's slow down, let's contemplate and ask ourselves why we're really doing all these things. And if that's really helping the public good, or if it's serving somebody else. I'll take it off the share screen now. Again, you can always come back and pause as you like. But, you know, another good question that kind of piggybacks off of Tolentino, which is a question that someone asked me once and I've never forgotten it. And I ask my students this question. It's a rhetorical question that I ask them for themselves all the time. But when they come to me with issues and they're stressed out and they're going, I got X, Y, and Z, and I'm doing this and I'm doing that, and you know, I'm experiencing this result that, you know, can either be positive or negative or neutral or whatever. Always remember this question. Whom does it serve? Does it serve you or does it serve somebody else? And I guess I'll leave you on that note because it's a good note to leave you. I hope this was more helpful than the other video. If you have any questions, always feel free to contact me, and see you all in cyberspace. Bye.